Hey guys, so today we're talking about hard bop. Now, hard bop was the dominant genre of jazz from about the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. Now, it's characterized by a strong blues and gospel influence, a kind of return to roots for jazz, as well as a little bit of a Latin influence. So essentially all that means is that it made heavy use of the blues scale, of dominant chords, of sort of blue notes and bent notes, used a lot of repetition, used a lot of call and response, and also used suspended chords and pedal points, which is that gospel influence. Now, hard bop songs are generally written in a minor key, which again is that bluesy influence, and it was very emotive and raw and hot. It had a strong driving rhythm with a heavy backbeat, which just means that it had a strong accent on beats 2 and 4 of each bar, and this set up a strong, solid rhythmic groove. And because of these strong rhythmic features, hard bop was actually the last genre of jazz that people actually danced to. It generally used slow and medium tempos, and it had simpler, more lyrical and more memorable melodies. And because of this, it actually made jazz popular again, just like swing music before it, as it was more accessible to the general public when compared to bebop. It generally used 12 or 32 bar forms and using that head solo head performance structure. And whereas in bebop, the melody of the head was generally played in unison by a trumpet and a saxophone, in hard bop, the melody of the head was usually played harmonized. And they generally used small ensembles, so generally a rhythm section with 2 or 3 horns. Now, hard bop arose due to some combination of the following reasons: as a reaction to cool jazz, as a result of the rise of rhythm and blues in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and to return bebop to melody. Now, I have a separate video on cool jazz where I discuss this genre in detail. But in short, throughout most of jazz history, there have been 2 countervailing forces pulling on it. On the one hand, jazz was pulled towards a more classical tradition, generally by Caucasian musicians, though not exclusively. And on the other hand, jazz was pulled towards a more blues tradition, generally by African American musicians. Well, cool jazz was the former. It was heavily influenced by the European classical music tradition. It was restrained and less emotional, it relied more on composition than improvisation, and it was softer and more polite. So in a word, it was played cool. So hard bop was partly a reaction to this trend towards the classical influenced cool jazz, and it decidedly tried to pull jazz back towards its roots, back towards blues. So rather than being cool, hard bop was hot. Now, as well as a reaction to cool jazz, hard bop was heavily influenced by the rise of rhythm and blues and black popular music in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Now, the blues had been around for decades, of course, but it was only in the 1940s and 50s, when it was electrified and amplified, did it become hugely popular. So there was the rise of gospel with people like Mahalia Jackson, the rise of Chicago blues with people like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, the rise of soul, which is just secularized gospel, with people like Ray Charles, the rise of rock and roll with people like Chuck Berry, and the rise of rhythm and blues with people like Fats Domino and Professor Longhair. And 2 of my particular favorites are Professor Longhair's Tipatina, and Fats Domino's Blueberry Hill. kind of style of music that was gaining popularity in the 50s. And so it was only natural that jazz musicians would be heavily influenced by this blossoming in blues and roots music. And so hard bop took on a lot of this rhythm and blues feel, and indeed many jazz musicians also played in R&B groups. And also, before bebop, there was swing music, which was melodic, danceable, and popular music. Then the rise of bebop turned jazz into an intellectual art music, with angular and difficult melodies, fast tempos, complex harmonies, and fast chord changes. For example, it had melodies like this. Now that's actually a 12-bar blues, but as you can hear, it's not very bluesy. Bebop was complex and undanceable, and therefore unpopular. So hard bop moved back in the other direction. It used simpler melodies that were easier to sing, a slower tempo, a strong backbeat, a solid bluesy groove, all of which made it very danceable and thus popularized jazz again. But it still retained some of bebop's harmonic and improvisational complexities. Now, like so many genres of jazz, Miles Davis was partially responsible for creating hard bop with his 1954 recordings of the songs Walkin' and Bluin' Boogie. But the quintessential hard bop band was really the Jazz Messengers. Now, when Horace Silver was leading the band, they had a hit with a song called The Preacher, which goes like this. Now, as you can hear, that has a slight gospel influence, and it sounds very old-timey. And in fact, it was almost not released at all because it was considered a little bit anachronistic and a little bit antiquated. And then when Art Blakey was leading the band, they had a hit with Moanin'. very bluesy song, and have a listen to the difference between the melody of this song and the melody of Billy's Bounce, which, as I said before, was a bebop 12-bar blues. Right, so it had a nice, simple bluesy melody that just used the blues scale. And then it had a nice call and response. And in fact, that's a plagal cadence, a 4-1, which is a very church-like cadence. It's also known as the Amen cadence. So those two songs are really the best known hard bop standards. And so as you can hear, hard bop pulled jazz right back to a more simplified, bluesier kind of sound. Now, some people further subdivide hard bop into a subgenre called soul jazz, which, as the name implies, was influenced by soul music. Now, soul jazz generally used the Hammond organ. So with musicians like Grant Green or Jimmy Smith or Big John Patton. Now, to hear the distinction between this kind of mainstream hard bop and soul jazz, have a listen to any one of those musicians, or check out the song Mercy, Mercy, Mercy by Cannonball Adderley, and you'll get the general feeling or vibe of soul jazz immediately. But generally, as I said, it almost always uses a Hammond organ. It's gospel and soul inspired. Compared to bebop, it's harmonically very, very simple. It generally only uses 2 or 3 chord vamps for the entire song, and often just uses triads rather than any kind of altered or extended chords. And each song is generally highly repetitive and very long. But like I said, some people do classify this soul jazz subcategory as a separate genre, while others just lump it in with the general hard bop genre of jazz, because after all, it is blues and gospel inspired. And you'll notice that hard bop, and especially soul jazz songs and recordings, were much longer than bebop recordings. Now, this was largely because the LP, the long play vinyl record, was released in 1948. So the type of vinyl records that we're all familiar with now. And because the LP only rotated at 33 1/3 RPM, this allowed musicians to record for up to 20 minutes per side. So that means a single song can go for as long as 20 minutes. Now, before the LP was introduced, musicians were limited to a maximum of about 3 or 4 minutes per recording, because the records rotated at 78 RPM. And this is why so many swing and bebop recordings are so short. Cool, so I've listed a few hard bop artists up here in the picture-in-picture, which you can check out at your own leisure. Otherwise, that's it for me. Thanks again for watching, and as always, feel free to leave any questions or comments. See you guys.